Hi everyone, I'm Kim from Inogesis. Today we brought together Rob Kerner from Inogesis and Layla White from Techpassport to talk about the challenges in onboarding with startups into corporates. Rob, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Kim. That's great. As Kim mentioned, I'm the CEO of Inogesis. I've been there for the last 2 years. My background is basically what it's all might call varied. I've sort of had 3 careers, I guess. One career was sort of a fighter pilot in the U.S. Navy for 10 years, coming out of university in the U.S., obviously. And the last 25 years, I basically split between working in big corporates, about 12 and a half of those years, and about 5 tech startups for the other 12 and a half years. I guess sort of, especially from my time when I was at sort of RBS, my last sort of corporate role, I ran an innovation team for 2 years, specifically around scouting for new technologies and trying to get them through procurement and into proof of concept. I really saw kind of the pain from a large corporation perspective, and then also having worked in tech startups, trying to work with big corporates, I felt the same pain. And I guess that's where Inogesis plays. Basically, is really we look at kind of how do we speed that up. And I met Layla through one of her employees, but I think what they were doing really interests me around how did they kind of fix this problem that we're sort of talking about today.
So I'm Layla White from Techpassport. I had most of my career working in banks, global banks, and I set Techpassport up a year ago after having been in generally vendor-facing roles, so commercial management, procurement, vendor management roles. And more recently, my last tenure was at HSBC, onboarding fintechs and startups, and saw that there was, some standout challenges for onboarding small companies, and saw it very much from the bank side and the challenges, and knew that there was a bit of a gap and a desire to work faster and to onboard faster for various reasons, and felt that having a silo kind of approach, silo oriented approach doesn't necessarily work. And so I set Techpassport up, and now I get to see it from the supplier side as well. But yeah, I was introduced to Rob through Matt, who works for me, and we've got some great synergies between us.
Great, thanks guys. Okay, let's jump right in with the questions. So based on your background and experiences, what do you feel are the major barriers for getting new technology through to a proof of concept?
And maybe I can start just from my I speak from my role at in RBS from the innovation side. So I think that the first thing to say is that, from the outside, maybe you think these organizations are very dysfunctional. They don't see what's happening in the real world out there, and nobody wants to make any changes. That's not really the case at all. There is a culture there that's running a big organization, and it is a massive organization. But I guess, there is a culture piece, and there's also really a process piece. What I saw from being the innovation guy trying to let's say, push my startups through the systems was that the system really wasn't set up for that. So it's not that it's sort of, I don't want to help you. It's that, I have a sort of a massive checklist that's set up to bring Microsoft on, and it doesn't work for this small thing. So I think it's a bit of culture, a bit of processes. And I think, Layla, you must have seen this from your roles and what you're doing now.
Absolutely. I think certainly from my experience on the bank side, I'd say that the processes have traditionally always been focused on working with larger corporates. And so when you step into the realm with fintechs, POCs are frequently used, but the processes really aren't set up to enable POCs, and it tends to be a very linear kind of approach. But when you incorporate POCs, it becomes this real stop, start, get to a point, start again kind of approach. And then on the other side, actually, what we found is that quite often startups aren't necessarily ready to work with banks, and that's where we can see a lot of the delays, not just from a POC perspective, but actually from an onboarding perspective once it's selected.
Okay, and what were the key challenges that you saw in particular from procurement teams?
I guess back from my side, really, my first reaction probably was they're just out here to stop me, and why am I going through all these checklists? And I think one thing that the procurement teams don't realize is that, almost if you only do one procurement of a thing once every 6 months, it's a very complicated process, right? And again, back to Layla's point about the startups, I mean, a company's only been around for 6 months, has no revenue. They're not set up to kind of go get all this information that the bank sort of requiring. So yeah, it felt a little bit like, I think you mentioned disjointed. If you think about a large corporate, last thing would be, I'd say, is a large corporate like Microsoft has a whole team of procurement people that's what they do all day. and I'm talking to procurement people, so they have a very quick kind of handoff of data, handoff of kind of communication. So
yeah, I would agree. I think that traditionally with procurement, there are always delays, and there's always a bit of a kind of like a bit of push and pull between the business who wants to do things really fast, and then procurement who have to protect the bank. Basically, that's their job. But certainly, I think one of the standout things for me that I experienced working in procurement with fintech is that, again, with the use of proof of concepts being used more regularly, my workload was just, it wasn't necessarily that I was like busier, but I had a larger number of projects, and so it becomes quite difficult to manage. So to give you an example, if there were 10 different project managers and they all wanted to try out 3 different products, that's 30 contracts that you've got to put into place. And so the current processes just don't fit for it, and I genuinely feel that the procurement teams are just under so much pressure and so busy with this sort of constant push and pull, with needing to do things faster, but just maybe not having the resources available. And then conversely, working with startups who haven't engaged with banks before, who perhaps haven't had to look at a proof of concept contract before, need to get a lawyer to have a look at it.
Didn't you also see the business people don't appreciate the risks that a bank has? And I talk for myself. I mean, I remember there was a guy from Sanctions was sort of trying to stop me from doing something. And I kind of always had to like, what is the problem, right? And he said, hey, if we send £1 to Iran, basically we're going to be fined £2 million and it's going to be a massive story in the newspaper tomorrow. And then you go, okay, that's a good point, right? That maybe we should make sure we don't do that.
How do you think companies can improve the way they evaluate and onboard companies faster and more safely?
Layla, you're probably closer to that than me. Go ahead.
I guess it depends. Like depending on who you talk to, different banks have decided to take a different, a lower risk appetite, like change their risk appetite from different POCs. We're definitely seeing that across the market. So dummy data, like low risk POCs are being used quite a lot, and it means that you get to try before you buy. And I think that that's sort of like the main kind of way to go. Generally, questions in terms of like negotiations that come up quite a lot is around liability, limitations of liability. And I guess with new technologies, especially so like in the open banking space, or where perhaps like digital identification or PI data is being used, there's obviously a reluctance to relax that too much. I think it would be good to maybe try and move into a bit of a generic kind of approach, or like an industry best practice approach with these, and understanding that the bank is dealing with a small company. I think that's probably a good way to go. It's a good starter.
Yeah, those are great points. I mean, I think that people have tried sandboxes and things like that. So the idea of kind of putting the proof of concept in a sort of safe container, so that if it sort of has a problem, it doesn't sort of infect the whole bank, obviously. I like your idea of kind of working across industry, and there is some stuff obviously happening.
Do you think companies should have 2 procurement systems, i.e. a light version or a full version? What are the pros and cons of doing this?
So the business people would say absolutely, right? And I think I probably said that the first day I got there, like, why can't I have my mini one, that I go through? But I'll say my perspective from the business side is, again, the same problem is if you use a very light procurement process, then you really haven't maybe delved into the product deep enough kind of flush out the risks. So what you're trying to do in a proof of concept is, what are the things that I need to fix in that thing before I touch the next step? I mean, from procurement's perspective, it must be double the work, right? It's sort of not double the work, but you got these 2 things going. You have 30 projects, half are on this, half are on that. I mean,
personally, I think that having a light and a full version makes sense. Personally, from a procurement perspective, I think that the target at the end of the day, from a procurement person, my business, the business are my customers, the suppliers are kind of my customers. And yes, it adds to the workload, but I think it makes sense really to have a different approach. Yes, you do need to get into the nitty-gritty of the detail, but I think in terms of accelerating that initial pass and for low risk software or low risk technology, I think it completely makes sense from my perspective.
It goes back to what the business case is trying to prove, right? So if I used to say, this software is being used in HSBC, Barclays, and every place else. Why are we testing this? It's the same banks, same systems, same thing. No, we have to test it on our systems. Like, okay, so it's sort of this reluctance to kind of take another proof of concept from another organization or another test, and having to do that makes it kind of, I think, interesting.
I think you're right. It does depend on what the business is asked for. Certainly in my experience, there was always this request that things were tested on their own infrastructure because of any kind of complications with their infrastructure or any legacy systems and how it might differ from other systems. But I think that I would probably hazard a guess that most of the technologies worked as expected when they were actually put on. As a procurement person, I think that having a light touch and a more heavier kind of take on from a contracting perspective kind of makes sense. But yeah, it's just more workload.
Do you think that the problem is more of a technology, process, or culture issue?
It goes back to what I said in the beginning. It's probably a combination of all three of those things. And people get hung up with the technology piece and they spend a lot of time with that. I think it's actually more the process and culture piece that is slowing things down. It's also this a mentality that this is something that's going to break the mothership and put us in. And to be fair, banks in particular are under a lot of scrutiny. So I mean, if an ATM network goes out for an hour, it's like you're on the front page of the newspaper. So the appetite for risk, rightly so, is pretty darn high, for not having these kind of problems. But I think to Layla's point earlier on, they have to speed up because they're being disrupted. The bigger fintechs now are properly eating into their business now. So your kind of TransferWises and Revolut and Monzos are all sort of now become proper companies and are really properly challenging that, along with the challenger banks as well. So there is a race that's going on here. They have to, speed is important, but it's quite a hard balance between the two.
I would agree. I think they're the two standout points. I think the process and then hand in hand is the culture. Going back to the point earlier that this is the way things have always been done. This is how we engage with larger corporates, and the fintech kind of space takes up a much fairly smaller spend size in terms of size in terms of spend, and so maybe not necessarily as much attention is put on fintech, perhaps, and perhaps that's going to change. But for a large organisation to change their processes to cater for that, I think it requires a big cultural shift, basically. There's definitely an appetite from the banks and the businesses, like Rob said, to do things faster. There's an acceptance that if other banks, smaller banks, can do it faster, why can't they? And also, I mean, I've heard of experiences where it's taken 2 years to get technology on, by which point technology has moved on greatly. I think the procurement teams and the central teams recognise there's a demand there as well, but it just takes a bit of a shift for them from a cultural perspective then to implement changes into their processes. And I guess coupled with the fact that there's probably a huge amount of investment in existing tools and processes to make that change, but I think the change is kind of coming.
I think just on the tech side, to finish that off, I mean, there is an issue, right? You have kind of core systems here on a bank, which are not built to be flexible. They're built for high volume, and they're very good at that, obviously. But then you have all the fintechs are looking for APIs that plug into that. So there's this sort of orchestration layer that needs to be put in place, and those exist now. And those are there are some companies that are doing that. So there is a technology piece that's very specific to just how do I plug into your data and get that? It's doable and it's being done now.
Okay, I'd like to focus on suppliers now. What do you feel is the impact to the supplier when it comes to delays?
So I read an article, I've been speaking to a guy actually, who talked about how time for a supplier is like dog years. That I think from a supplier side, one month is like 3 months to a supplier. And I think especially when we talk about fintechs and startups, and if a startup especially hasn't engaged with a bank before, they're going into new territory. And I mean, I spoke to one supplier who had was under an umbrella company and had the backing and supporting of a large company. And the first time they engaged with a bank, it took them an extra 6-7 weeks to get their documentation together, even when they had the opportunity to have templates given to them. So if you try and imagine what it's like for a startup that has an amazing piece of technology, and we're seeing a lot of this, it's really exciting, but quite often they're not prepared. The pressure on them to find the time and the resources, and I think, Rob, we talked about it before, a large company will have a whole team that can go and focus on those. But when you're a startup, and we've got just under 10 people in our team, to try and divert our resources had we not known, I mean, we've made it our business to know, but had we not known about it, that's a huge undertaking. And then in terms of time, like that time is money, but for a startup, it's huge. So I think that's what kind of we're seeing. The other things that we're seeing as well is even those who are engaging with banks regularly, what they find is that the requirements from each bank, one bank to the next, fairly similar, some slight nuances, but having to, again, set time aside on the off chance that they might get a POC with that bank is really, really time consuming and consumes a lot of costs, basically. Traditionally, from my experience working in banks, I wasn't necessarily aware of the implications that these delays, or me not being able to get back to a supplier because I was so busy, the implications that it has on them.
I think there's a strategic side to that as well. So a startup will have a strategic plan of how they're going to grow their company. And when they get pulled into, they're kind of trying to get something going, in your case, maybe you're trying to get to a bank, and all of a sudden somebody at the bank says, that sounds cool, or something along those lines, like, that sounds interesting. All of a sudden, everything you do stops and turns over and you start running full speed that way. So, I had to learn from my side. I'm quite a positive person, and I'm always like, that sounds really interesting. And, I have these guys sort of calling me back the next day and wanting to do demos, and you're thinking, I just said it was interesting. I didn't say I kind of, because they're not appreciating that, that there's a huge complexity from the bank side as well to really selling your idea. So I think one of the dangers for startups is really they can really pull them off their strategic plan. And of course, the big corporate says, hey, could you do this? That would help us. Of course, you say yes. So that all of a sudden they're putting resources, and then the proof of concept fails, or as you say, drags on too long even. It's like, well, we just spent $50K sort of fixing our tech for you. Oh yeah, now we're not interested, or we decide not to do it. So I think, the banks have a real obligation to be as transparent and clear with the startups as well, not to mess them about.
I think that's a really, really valid point, actually, really well articulated. I think that perhaps with engaging with suppliers and large suppliers, there's not an appreciation as to the impact that these delays and these changes can have on the small suppliers.
Definitely.
But actually, when you talk to startups, quite often they might be bootstrapped. People might have remortgaged their properties for this, and it's everything to them. And to, as you say, like you from a supplier's perspective, you get like an opportunity with a big major player. You're like, yeah, we're in there. You're almost like trying not to celebrate. But as you say, the root system underneath it, and I think that's sometimes where suppliers get sort of stung, because they think maybe they're talking to the right person. They've got 2 or 3 different stakeholders, and they don't realise actually there are so many more layers to go. And that's where they get caught up. And in their financial planning, I've seen it time and time again, like in financial planning, you think, right, I'm going to focus this much time, energy, resources, and I'm going to get a sale in 9 months. And actually that stretches way out. And the difference it has to a supplier, a startup supplier, is that that's a make or break for some suppliers. And I've seen countless examples, or heard of countless examples. We've got some statistics, actually, about 87%, I think it was, I might have it wrong. But so many suppliers start going through the process and back out because it becomes too arduous, too complicated, too costly. And there are so many suppliers with amazing technology that are actually really nervous about going near big corporates and big banks for that particular reason. And then from a bank side, you're missing out on this amazing technology. But I think you're right, it has to be about transparency.
And the last thing I would say, that's a great point. I mean, this is fantastic because both you and I have sort of this, the view of the situation. And the other one I saw was interesting, was kind of, corporates moving too slowly. They don't realize that the best startups, they're all talking because they're all level 39 or whatever. And believe me, they know which bank is the hardest to work with, and they're going to go someplace else. So in a way, you think, it's no big deal, back to your point of how it's sort of messing this startups about. But the best ones have already gone to the other bank because they realize you're taking too long to deal with, and they won't do it. So it's a little kind of insidious piece of from the bank's perspective, not getting the best stuff coming at you.
Yeah, and suppliers talk. I mean, they,
Yeah.
even without having like level 39, obviously, they know who are the most difficult players. Suppliers won't go near. So I think you're right. It has to be like transparency on both sides, really.
Okay, final question now. What's the impact to the supplier when having to provide large amounts of repetitive information to each organisation, for example, a bank, without having any assurance that they are actually going to have a contract at the end of it?
I spoke to a supplier only yesterday who, and they've got quite a sizable company, 500 people in their company, so not like a startup. And he said that we go through this time and time again, where we're running a POC and then we're asked to provide information. It's so similar across the board. I've heard of banks actually asking a couple of times, what if we had our own tool to capture all of this information? We could put this into the public domain, and suppliers could come and at their leisure put all of their information and answer all our security questions, upload all their compliance documents. And I think genuinely, I think it's just not seeing it from the other side. I think the banks just don't appreciate that. I can hand on my heart say that I have been very, very busy in previous roles. I think once you go into a startup, I don't think, and you're a CEO, I don't think anyone could ever tell you that they're busier than you. So trying to then divert time, the notion of taking someone in my team like Matt and saying, go and register all your information to all these different portals, it's just crazy. And the cost, the time, everything is just you know, it's a huge impact to them. And without having even confirmation that you're even going to have a POC off the back of it, let alone an agreement. I mean, let's be honest, a POC is a stepping stone. Suppliers don't go into agreements because they want a trial. They want the contract, they want the money, they want the revenue. Having a paid for POC is like, doesn't matter, that's just a stepping stone. So even when you don't have confirmation of a POC, to have a supplier or think that a supplier would go onto every individual platform, add that information, it's just, yeah, it's unfathomable, really. But and it's a big pressure on the suppliers.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah.
Okay.
Nothing to add there. You said, well said.
Okay, Rob and Layla, thank you so much for sharing your opinion, experiences and insights with us today. And for those who are watching, we hope you found it helpful and informative. Until next time.